They didn't show up for my daughter's 8th birthday. Not a single call, not a card, nothing. 3 days later, my sister texted, asking for $1,850 for catering I never ordered. When I told her no, she didn't argue or try to reason with me. She simply called the police. What she didn't know was that I had recorded everything. She had no idea that my simple refusal would cost her far more than just money. My name is Rachel Morgan. I'm 38 years old, and I live in a small 2-story colonial in Fairview, Ohio, a town where the lawns are perpetually green and the secrets are kept behind freshly painted front doors. It's the kind of place that prides itself on community, on block parties and PTA meetings, a facade of cheerful normalcy that I've learned to navigate with a polite, practiced smile. I'm a single mother to the brightest part of my world, my 8-year-old daughter, Ava. For her, I would burn down the world. For years, however, I settled for just trying to get my own family to acknowledge hers. Being the overly independent child in the Morgan family was a label given to me early on, a polite way of saying I was the one who couldn't be easily controlled or guilted. My younger sister, Melissa, was the social butterfly, the charming one who could wrap our mother, Diane, around her little finger with a single tearful phone call. I was the responsible one, the one who left home at 18, put myself through college, and built a life from scratch. This independence, which I saw as a strength, they treated as a rejection. It meant I was a resource to be tapped, not a daughter to be cherished. Over the years, I became an afterthought, a reliable but distant fixture in their lives, remembered only when they needed something alone, a babysitter, a co-signer. Despite the long history of casual neglect and thinly veiled dismissals, a stubborn, foolish part of me still craved connection. For Ava, my daughter deserved grandparents, an aunt, cousins. She deserved the sprawling, messy, chaotic love of a big family that I saw in the Christmas movies we watched together. So, against my better judgment, I decided to try one more time. For her 8th birthday, I would throw the party to end all parties. An event so full of joy and effort that they simply couldn't ignore it. It felt like a final, desperate plea for them to see us, to see my daughter. I mailed out thick, glittery invitations 2 months in advance. I followed up with cheerful texts and phone calls, securing verbal confirmations from everyone: my mother, my sister and her husband, their 2 kids, my aunts, uncles, and a handful of cousins. 24 family members in total. 24 promises that this time would be different. The day of the party was a perfect, sun-drenched Saturday in early September. The air was warm, with just a hint of the coming autumn crispness. I'd spent a small fortune transforming our modest backyard into a child's wonderland. A large white tent stood proudly in the center of the lawn, its canopy shielding a long banquet table decorated with a pastel rainbow tablecloth. 24 white folding chairs were arranged neatly around it, each one a symbol of my relentless optimism. Pink, purple, and gold balloons bobbed gently in the breeze, tied to the tent poles in the back of each chair. A professional-grade bounce house, shaped like a fairy tale castle, hummed expectantly in the corner. The centerpiece, sitting on its own dedicated table, was the cake. It was a magnificent 3-tiered confection from the best bakery in town, a masterpiece called Unicorn Dreams. It was covered in shimmering white fondant, with a cascade of edible flowers tumbling down its sides and a majestic, golden horn spiraling from the top. It smelled of vanilla and sugar and hope. The party was set to start at 2 o'clock. At 1:45, Ava was practically vibrating with excitement, her brown curls bouncing as she ran in circles around the yard, her unicorn-themed party dress flaring out around her. I stood on the patio, smoothing my own dress, my heart a nervous drum against my ribs. Everything was perfect. The cooler was stocked with juice boxes and soda. A mountain of presents was piled on a table, and a playlist of Ava's favorite pop songs was ready to go. All that was missing were the guests. 2 o'clock came and went. The street outside remained silent. No cars pulled into the driveway. No familiar voices drifted over the fence. "They're probably just stuck in traffic, sweetie," I told Ava. forcing a breezy smile as I checked my phone for the 10th time. No missed calls, no texts. At 2:30, the silence in the backyard began to feel heavy, oppressive. The cheerful pop music suddenly sounded hollow and mocking. Ava's circles became slower, her excited chatter fading. She came to stand beside me, her small hand slipping into mine. "Maybe Grandma's GPS broke again," she asked, her voice small. She was referencing a flimsy excuse my mother had used for missing her school play last spring. The innocence of the question was a physical blow. It was my job to protect her from this casual cruelty, to shield her from the knowledge that she wasn't a priority to the people who were supposed to love her unconditionally. I had to swallow the lump of rage and humiliation forming in my throat to answer her. "You know what, I bet that's exactly it." "Honey," I said, my voice miraculously steady. "And Aunt Melissa probably forgot to write down the new address. They'll be here soon. Why don't we have a piece of cake while we wait?" Her eyes lit up at the mention of cake. The flicker of doubt momentarily extinguished, but I knew, as I cut 2 perfect slices from the untouched Unicorn Dreams masterpiece, I knew they weren't coming. We sat together at the head of the long, empty table, 2 lonely figures in a sea of vacant chairs. We ate our cake in near silence, the sweetness of the frosting feeling like ash in my mouth. By 4 o'clock, the sun was beginning to cast long shadows across the yard, and the bounce house had begun to sag slightly. The hope I had so carefully nurtured all day had curdled into a cold, hard certainty. Before I started to take anything down, I pulled out my phone. My hands were steady now, my movements deliberate. I walked to the far end of the tent and framed the scene in my camera, the long, empty table, the 24 pristine, unoccupied chairs, the magnificent cake with only 2 small slices missing, the pile of unopened gifts. I took the picture, not out of self-pity, but as a promise to myself. This was the last time. This was the final, documented proof of their indifference. I would never again beg for their attention. I would never again subject my daughter to this kind of quiet heartbreak. That evening, after I'd tucked a weary and confused Ava into bed, I sat on the couch in the darkened living room, scrolling numbly through my phone. And then I saw it, a new post from my mother, uploaded just an hour earlier. It was a photo of her and Melissa, their faces flushed and smiling, raising glasses of red wine over plates of sizzling steak. My 2 cousins were in the background, laughing. The location tag was for a fancy steakhouse downtown. The caption, a brutal, 5-word punch to the gut, read, "Family time is the best time." I stared at the screen, at their smiling faces, and a feeling I hadn't allowed myself to acknowledge all day finally broke through the dam of forced cheerfulness. It was a pure, unadulterated rage. It started as a low hum in my chest and spread through my limbs, making my hands tremble. They hadn't forgotten. They hadn't gotten lost. They had made a choice. They had actively chosen a steak dinner over my daughter's birthday party. They hadn't even bothered to invent a plausible lie. They simply didn't care enough to cover their tracks, because they never expected me to do anything about it. I didn't cry. The time for tears was over. I got up and began the somber task of dismantling the party. I untied the balloons from the chairs one by one, the colorful latex squeaking in protest before I popped each one with a pin. The sharp, successive bangs were strangely satisfying, echoing the sound of my illusions shattering. I gathered the unused party favors, little bags of candy and unicorn trinkets, and dumped them into a trash bag. The rest of the glorious cake followed, its beautiful design ruined as I scraped it off the platter. My hands shook, not with sadness, but with the force of my contained fury. As I was sweeping up the last of the confetti from the patio, the door to the kitchen opened. Ava stood there, rubbing her eyes, her unicorn dress wrinkled from sleep. "I heard noises," she mumbled. I knelt down, my heart aching. "I'm sorry. Sweetie, I was just cleaning up. Go back to bed." She looked past me, at the no-empty yard, the deflated bounce house a sad heap of vinyl in the corner, a flicker of understanding, far too adult for her 8 years, crossed her face. She padded over to me and wrapped her small arms around my neck. "It's okay, Mom," she whispered into my ear. Her voice thick with sleep. We still had fun. Just us. Her words, meant to comfort, were the final spark. I held her tight, breathing in the scent of her shampoo and the faint sweetness of birthday cake. This wasn't just about me and my lifetime of being overlooked anymore. This was about her. They had made my daughter feel invisible. They had treated her joy as insignificant. And as I held her, a quiet, cold vow formed in the very marrow of my bones. If they insisted on treating my daughter as if she didn't exist, I would make damn sure they could never forget her mother. I would make them see us. The 3 days following the party were a study in silence. A thick, suffocating quiet replaced the years of strained phone calls and obligatory holiday texts. I didn't reach out, and neither did they. It wasn't the peaceful silence of resolution. It was the humming, charged silence of a power line right before it snaps. I spent the time meticulously cleaning my house, erasing every last trace of the failed celebration. I packed the unused unicorn-themed plates and napkins into a box and stored them in the attic, a time capsule of my own foolishness. I focused on Ava, taking her to the park, reading extra bedtime stories, and pouring all my energy into reinforcing the walls of our small, safe world of two. I was nursing a cold, hard knot of rage in my chest, but I kept it carefully hidden from her, burying it under a mountain of mundane tasks. Then, on Tuesday afternoon, my phone buzzed on the kitchen counter. It was a message from Melissa. For a split second, a foolish, conditioned part of me thought it might be an apology, a convoluted excuse, anything. That flicker of hope died the instant I read the text. "Hey, can you Venmo me $1.850?" I stared at the message, my mind refusing to process the sheer, unmitigated audacity. There was no greeting, no preamble, no mention of the weekend, just a cold, transactional demand. It was so absurd, so disconnected from our shared reality, that I almost laughed. It felt like a line from a badly written play. I set my phone down, took a deep breath, and picked it up again, my fingers typing a response with robotic calm. "For what?" The reply came back almost instantly, as if she'd been waiting with her thumbs hovering over the screen. "For the catering, for Ava's party, you canceled too late, and the company is charging me the full amount. It's a huge hassle. Rachel." The catering, I read the word over and over. I had personally made 3 dozen mini pizzas and a platter of pigs in a blanket. The only other food was the Unicorn Dreams cake I had paid for in cash 2 weeks prior. The lie was so lazy, so insultingly transparent. It was breathtaking. The one and only time I had spoken to Melissa about party logistics was a month ago. A brief, 5-minute call where I had asked her to please confirm with the aunts and cousins so I could get a final head count for the bounce house rental. She had sighed dramatically and agreed. As if I'd asked her to donate a kidney, there had never been a single mention of catering. A cold clarity washed over me, displacing the hot rage. This wasn't just an opportunistic grab for cash. This was a narrative. This was their story for why they didn't show up, in their version of events. I had left them in charge of a major part of the celebration, and then, irresponsibly, pulled the plug, leaving them to deal with the financial fallout. It was a neat, tidy fiction that painted them as the put-upon victims and me as the flaky, unreliable villain. I decided to play along, just for a moment. I don't recall ordering any catering through you. Melissa, can you send me the invoice from the company? It was a verbal agreement. Rachel, we talked about it on the phone. Don't you remember? You said you were too overwhelmed and asked me to handle the food. Now you're going to pretend it never happened. The gaslighting was so textbook it was almost cliché. No, Melissa, I don't remember that, because it didn't happen. I have the receipts for all the food I bought and the cake I ordered. I'm not sending you any money. My thumbs were steady as I typed, my pulse even. The years of emotional turmoil she and my mother had put me through had an unexpected side effect. They had forged me into something resilient, something that didn't shatter under pressure. The response was swift and venomous. Wow. So you're stealing from family now. After everything I did to try and help you with that party, unbelievable. Mom was right about you. I didn't dignify that with a reply. I simply set the phone down, took a screenshot of the entire exchange, and emailed it to myself with the subject line, Evidence A. I then went into my email and searched my inbox and spam folder for the word catering, invoice, and the names of every catering company in a 50-mile radius. As I knew it would, the search came up empty. I felt a grim sense of purpose solidifying within me. This was no longer just about a missed birthday. This was about a calculated attempt at fraud and defamation. An hour passed. I was helping Ava with her math homework at the kitchen table when the knock came. It wasn't the gentle tap of a neighbor or the rhythmic rap of a delivery driver. It was a loud, firm, official knock, 3 solid thuds that vibrated through the floor. Ava looked up at me, her eyes wide. I felt a jolt of adrenaline, but my expression remained calm for her sake. I'll be right back. Sweetie? Probably just someone with a package for the wrong house. I opened the front door to find 2 Fairview police officers standing on my porch. One was older, with a weary face and a thick mustache. The other was younger, barely out of his 20s, with a clipped, serious haircut. The sight of their uniforms, the black leather of their belts and holsters, was so incongruous with the quiet, suburban tranquility of my street that it felt like a scene from a movie. Rachel Morgan, the older officer, asked, his voice a gravelly monotone. Yes, that's me. Is everything all right? We've received a complaint regarding a financial dispute, he said, not unkindly, from a Melissa Albright, your sister. I believe she's alleging a fraudulent charge and a breach of a verbal agreement. I had to physically restrain myself from smiling. It was so much faster, so much more theatrical than I had anticipated. My sister hadn't just threatened me. She had actually called the police. She had weaponized the law over a lie she had invented less than 2 hours ago. Of course, I said, my voice even and polite. Please, come in. I believe I have everything you need to clear this up. I led them into the living room, a space of calm grays and blues, a stark contrast to the chaotic drama unfolding. Ava poked her head around the corner, and I gave her a reassuring nod. Mommy just has to talk to these officers for a minute. Honey, can you go finish your worksheet in the kitchen? She retreated without a word, sensing the gravity in my tone. I gestured for the officers to sit on the sofa, but they remained standing, their presence filling the room. Ms. Morgan, the younger one began, pulling out a small notebook. Ms. Albright claims you entered into a verbal contract for her to arrange catering services for a party, in the amount of $1,850. She claims you canceled without notice, and she is now liable for that payment. I listened patiently until he was finished. Then, I walked over to the console table and picked up my tablet. Officers, I began, my voice clear and steady. I understand you have to follow up on every complaint, but what my sister has told you is a complete fabrication. There was no verbal agreement. There was no catering. There was, however, a birthday party for my 80-year-old daughter this past Saturday. My sister, along with 23 other family members, RSVP'd. Yes, none of them showed up. I unlocked the tablet and opened a folder I had created just an hour before, labeled simply, The Party. First, here are my receipts. I showed them the dated receipt from the bakery for the Unicorn Dreams cake and the grocery store receipts from Friday night, itemizing mini pizza crusts, hot dogs, and juice boxes. As you can see, I purchased and prepared all the food myself. I then swiped to the next file. This is a screenshot of the text message I sent to my sister a month ago, the only conversation we had about party logistics, where I asked her to help with the head count. The officers leaned in, reading the short, innocuous exchange. Next, I opened the screenshot of the text conversation from that afternoon. And this, I said, is my sister demanding $1,850 from me an hour ago, and my refusal. The older officer's eyes scanned the messages, his expression unreadable. The younger one scribbled furiously in his notebook. Finally, I said, my voice dropping slightly, My sister and mother claimed they couldn't make it to the party. This is a screenshot from my mother's social media page, which she posted at 5 p.m. on Saturday, during the party. I turned the tablet to face them. The image was bright and clear, my mother and sister, smiling over their steaks and wine. The caption, "Family time is the best time," glowing beneath them. I had even taken the liberty of circling the timestamp. There was a long moment of silence in the room. The only sound was the scratching of the young officer's pen. The older officer looked up from the tablet, his gaze meeting mine. He wasn't looking at me like a potential suspect anymore. He was looking at me with a weary sort of sympathy. He had seen this kind of ugly, messy family drama 100 times before. He took a slow breath and finally shook his head. A small, almost imperceptible movement. "Ma'am," he said, his voice low and gravelly, "this looks like a setup." A slow smile spread across my face. It wasn't a happy smile. It was a smile of grim, cold validation. The trap had been sprung, but I wasn't the one who was caught in it. "Exactly," I said. After the police officers left, their parting words echoing in the sudden quiet of my living room, the house seemed to exhale. The tension that had held the air hostage dissipated, leaving behind the normal, mundane sounds of a Tuesday afternoon, the hum of the refrigerator, the distant drone of a lawnmower, the faint scratching of Ava's pencil on paper in the kitchen. But inside me, a storm had just begun to gather. The officer's validation, the simple, tired phrase, "Ma'am, this looks like a setup," hadn't brought me relief. It had brought me focus. It had taken all the swirling, chaotic emotions of the past few days, the hurt, the humiliation, the white-hot anger, and forged them into a single, sharp point. This was their pattern. This was the family dance I had been forced to participate in for 38 years. My mother, Diane, was the choreographer of our dysfunctional ballet, and her favorite refrain, always delivered with a sigh of weary resignation, was, "She's just more social." Rachel. It was her all-purpose excuse for my sister's behavior, a coat of paint slapped over every crack in Melissa's character. When Melissa maxed out a credit card, it was because she was generous and had so many friends to treat. When she forgot a major family event, it was because her social calendar was just so demanding. When she lied, it was because she was trying to keep the peace, to make a story more palatable for her sensitive audience. Being social was a get-out-of-jail-free card, a euphemism for being manipulative, charmingly irresponsible, and utterly self-absorbed. My role in this production was that of the overly independent one, in our family. This was not a compliment. It was an indictment. It meant I didn't need them, which in my mother's translation meant I didn't love them properly. Independence wasn't seen as strength. It was seen as a withholding. I didn't call my mother in tears over a financial crisis. I didn't need Melissa to mediate a trivial argument with a friend. I handled my own problems, paid my own bills, and built my own safety nets. This made me stable and reliable, but it also made me useless as a source of drama. The currency our family ran on, I was a closed loop, a self-sustaining system, and they found that deeply frustrating. You couldn't manipulate someone who didn't need anything from you. Their attempts to pull me into their orbit were always transactional. They came to me not for emotional support, but for resources. This latest fiasco with the police wasn't the first time they had tried to use my name and my stability for their own gain. I thought back to when I was 24, just starting my first real job. Melissa had called me in a manufactured panic. Her car had broken down. She needed a new one immediately to get to her very important job as a part-time receptionist. But her credit was a mess. It was always a mess. My mother got on the line, her voice dripping with concern. "Rachel, honey, you've always been so good with money. Could you just co-sign, just to help your sister get back on her feet? It's just a formality." I was younger then, still susceptible to the siren song of their approval. I hesitated, a knot of unease in my stomach, but they were relentless. I was family. This is what family did. I caved. For 6 months, everything was fine. Then, a letter arrived, a collections notice from the auto loan company. My sister was 3 months behind on her payments. My pristine credit score, which I had painstakingly built since I was a teenager, had a fresh, ugly black mark on it. When I confronted them, there was no apology. Melissa cried, claiming the dealership had tricked her with the interest rates. My mother rushed to her defense. "It's just a misunderstanding. Rachel, don't be so dramatic. We'll sort it out." They never did. I ended up paying the 3 months of arrears myself to stop the damage, and they acted as if I owed them a thank you for the opportunity to be so generous. They had used my name, damaged my financial standing, and felt absolutely no remorse. It was a lesson I never forgot. But that was nothing compared to what Melissa did 3 years ago. It was the incident that had started the real deep freeze in our relationship, the one that proved to me she was capable of a kind of moral vacancy I couldn't comprehend. She had posted a picture of Ava on Facebook. It was a sweet photo I had taken at a local farm, with Ava, then 5, laughing as she held a small bunny. The accompanying text, however, was a nauseating work of fiction. Melissa had written a long, cloying caption about her brave little niece who was battling a rare respiratory illness. She was raising money, she claimed, for a special comfort fund at the local children's hospital to buy toys and blankets for the other sick kids on Ava's floor. My blood ran cold as I read it. Ava was, and had always been, perfectly healthy. I called Melissa immediately, my voice shaking with a rage so profound I could barely speak. She was breezy, unconcerned. "Oh, relax. Rachel, it's for a good cause. People are more likely to donate when there's a personal story attached." I asked her which hospital. She got vague. I hung up and called the hospital myself. I spoke to their fundraising department, their pediatric ward, their administrative office. No one had ever heard of a comfort fund. No official fundraiser was being run by a Melissa Albright. The entire story was a lie. Built around a stolen picture of my daughter, she was using Ava's face to solicit money from strangers, every dollar of which was going directly into her own pocket. The subsequent confrontation was a mushroom cloud. I drove to my mother's house, where Melissa was living at the time, and laid it all out: the lies, the call to the hospital, the utter depravity of using a healthy child as a prop for a scam. Melissa collapsed into a puddle of tears, not of remorse, but of self-pity. I was going to donate some of it. I just have so many bills right now. My mother wrapped her arms around her, glaring at me over Melissa's sobbing head. "You've always been jealous of her." "Rachel," she hissed. Her heart was in the right place. "You come in here and attack her like a criminal, all over a simple mistake." A simple mistake. That was the moment I understood. In their world, facts were irrelevant. The narrative was everything. And the narrative was always that Melissa was the fragile, well-intentioned victim, and I was the cold, unforgiving aggressor. Now, sitting in my silent living room, the ghosts of these past betrayals circled me. The fake catering bill wasn't a one-off act of desperation. It was the culmination of their life's work. They saw my daughter's 8th birthday not as a milestone to be celebrated, but as an opportunity to be monetized. Their plan was likely simple: invent a large, unverifiable expense, present me with the bill, and when I refused, use it as a pretext to paint me as the villain who ruined the party for everyone. It was their excuse for not showing up and a chance to extort money from me in one neat, tidy package. They would cry to the extended family about how they tried to help, how I was ungrateful and hostile, solidifying my role as the family pariah. But they made one catastrophic miscalculation. They had spent so many years seeing me as the emotional, overly sensitive daughter that they had completely overlooked the woman I had become. They forgot where I worked. They forgot what I did for a living. I am a senior auditor for a large corporate finance firm. My entire job, 8 to 10 hours a day, 5 days a week, is to sift through chaos and find the truth. I untangle complex webs of financial data. I identify discrepancies. I document evidence of malfeasance, and I build airtight cases that can stand up to intense legal scrutiny. I am professionally trained to be meticulous, impartial, and relentless. I know how to save emails. I know how to document timelines. I know how to cross-reference digital records with physical evidence. I know how to present a case so clearly and logically that there is no room for argument or emotional manipulation. A bitter, ironic thought surfaced, and for the first time that day, a genuine, mirthless smile touched my lips. They taught me to cover my tracks. I thought to myself, remembering the years I'd spent documenting their lies just to protect my own sanity. I had digital folders full of their manipulative texts, saved voicemails of their fake promises, notes from conversations with dates and times, all compiled as a defense mechanism against their constant gaslighting. Now I'll teach them what that really means. The pieces began to click into place in my mind, not as a jumbled mess of family drama, but as the clean, clear steps of an audit plan. The text messages were a record of attempted extortion. The social media post was a time-stamped alibi killer. The police report they had just initiated would serve as official documentation of their false claim. They had, in their bumbling arrogance, handed me every piece of evidence I needed. A profound shift occurred within me then, deep in my core, for my entire adult life. My interactions with my family had been about self-preservation. I had built walls to keep their toxicity out. My goal was simply to be left alone, to protect myself and my daughter from their endless cycle of drama and disappointment. But this was different. They had crossed a line that could not be uncrossed. They had tried to use the law to intimidate me. They had used my daughter's birthday as a weapon. They had stood on my porch, figuratively speaking, and tried to burn my house down. For the first time in my life, I didn't just want to defend myself. I didn't just want an apology or for them to leave me in peace. I wanted them to face a consequence, a real one, the kind that couldn't be erased with tears or a well-crafted lie, the kind that gets documented in a public record. This wasn't about revenge anymore. It was about accountability. For the first time in my life, I didn't want to protect myself from them. I wanted them to pay for what they had done. The quiet that settled over my house after the police left was deceptive. It was the calm of a chessboard after a foolish, aggressive opening move has been made by an opponent. All the pieces were still there, but the nature of the game had fundamentally changed. My initial shock had crystallized into a cold, diamond-hard resolve. They had escalated this from a private, painful family drama into a public, legal matter. And I, as it happened, was very, very good with matters that required evidence, documentation, and an unwavering adherence to the rules. My mind, trained for years to see patterns and seek proof, began to work. Melissa's claim of a verbal agreement was sloppy, but calling the police was an act of supreme confidence, arrogance, even. They must have believed they had something more, some piece of manufactured evidence to back up their fiction. What had I missed? I walked into my small home office, the nerve center of my life, and sat down at my desk. My gaze fell upon the monitor displaying the live feed from my doorbell camera, and then I knew. I had installed the camera system 2 years ago, not because Fairview was a dangerous town, but for the mundane conveniences seeing when packages arrived. Knowing if Ava got off the bus safely, it recorded all motion, storing the clips in the cloud for 30 days. It was a silent, impartial witness to the daily rhythm of my life. With a few clicks, I navigated to the archives. I didn't have to search for long. The timestamp I was looking for was Monday afternoon, the day before the text message arrived, the day after their celebratory steak dinner. There she was, Melissa. The footage was crisp and clear in the late afternoon sun. She pulled her oversized SUV into my driveway, a breach of our unspoken rule of parking on the street. She didn't get out of the car for a full minute, just sat there, looking at my front door. Even on the grainy video, I could see the nervous energy, the way she chewed on her lower lip. She wasn't the picture of a wronged party seeking justice. She was the image of a petty criminal building up her nerve. Finally, she got out, clutching a single folded piece of white paper in her hand. She scurried to the front door, glancing left and right down the empty street as if she were planting a bomb instead of delivering a note. She didn't knock. She didn't ring the bell. She carefully wedged the paper into the seam of the storm door, making sure it was held tight. Then she practically ran back to her car and sped away. The entire event took less than 45 seconds. I paused the video, a cold smile touching my lips. I knew what the paper was, and I knew she had just been filmed committing a crime on my property. I went to the front door, and sure enough, tucked neatly behind the rubber weather stripping, was a folded sheet of standard printer paper. My hands were perfectly steady as I unfolded it. It was exactly as I'd imagined, only more pathetic. At the top, in my sister's loopy juvenile handwriting, were the words, "Catering Agreement Rachel Morgan." Below was a short, misspelled list of generic food items, assorted sandwiches, pasta salad, fruit platter, and next to it, the grand total, $1,850 a hunt. There was no company name, no address, no phone number, no signature line, no date. It was the most amateurish, laughable attempt at an invoice I had ever seen. This was their ace in the hole. This flimsy, fraudulent document was what gave them the confidence to call the police. I laid the paper on my desk, took a high-resolution photo of it with my phone, and immediately sent the image to my best friend, Kayla. Kayla and I had been friends since college, but more importantly, she was now a partner at a downtown law firm, specializing in contract litigation. My text was simple. Hypothetically, what is this? Her reply came back in under a minute. Hypothetically, that's a poorly executed forgery. If she tried to pass it off as a real contract to law enforcement or in a financial dispute, that's a Class A misdemeanor in Ohio. Why? I typed back. No reason, just curious. Kayla's 3 dots appeared and then vanished. She knew me too well. Rachel, be smart. I'm an auditor. Kayla, I replied. Being smart is what I do. I saved a screenshot of our conversation. Evidence B. Now, it was time to set the bait. I picked up my phone, my heart beating a slow, steady, determined rhythm, and sent a new text to Melissa. I imagined her on the other end, waiting with my mother, flushed with their perceived victory, confident that their police stunt had scared me into submission. My message was a masterpiece of capitulation. Melissa, you're right. I'm so sorry. I've had a lot on my mind, and I completely forgot about the arrangements. I'll handle it. Can you send me your Venmo info again so I can take care of the bill? The mask of contrition felt strange on my face, even via text, but it was a necessary part of the plan. I had to lull them into a state of complacency. I had to make them believe they had won, that I was the cowed, forgetful sister they always thought I was. Her reply was instantaneous, dripping with condescending magnanimity. It's okay, Rachel. I understand you're under a lot of stress. I'm just glad we could clear this up before it got messy. My Venmo is at Melissa Albright Funds. Funds, the word snagged in my brain. It was an odd, slightly formal choice for a personal Venmo handle. It sounded like something you'd name an account for a fundraiser, and just like that, a dark, dusty door in my memory creaked open. The fake charity for the children's hospital, the one built on the face of my healthy daughter. While they sat back, waiting for the $1,850 to drop into their account, I went to work. My fingers flew across the keyboard, my office transforming from a quiet suburban workspace into a forensic accounting lab. A quick search of her Venmo handle online brought up a few public transactions from years ago, mostly payments from friends for brunch. But then I cross-referenced the handle with her full name and the term fundraiser. The search results were sparse, but one hit stood out, a cached page from a local community blog dated 2022. It mentioned a small investigation by the State Attorney General's office into several local online fundraisers for questionable practices. Listed among them, with a warning to donors, was a now-defunct GoFundMe page titled "Say Wand and Melissa's Family Events." My blood turned to ice. It was the same playbook, the same name structure. They hadn't just scammed friends and family with the hospital lie. They had a history, one that had actually brushed up against a real investigation. This wasn't just a pattern of behavior, it was a potential pattern of racketeering. I spent the next hour in a state of intense, focused activity. I downloaded the security camera footage of Melissa planting the invoice and saved it to 3 separate hard drives. I created a master folder on my secure cloud server, titled simply Case File 922, named for Ava's birthday. Inside, I created subfolders, each meticulously labeled. Exhibit A. Communications contained screenshots of every text message, from the initial demand to the fake apology, all arranged in chronological order. Exhibit B. Forgery held the high-resolution photo of the handwritten invoice and my text exchange with Kayla, the lawyer. Exhibit C. Timeline was a simple document where I laid out the events, the party, the 24 no-shows, the steakhouse social media post from my mother, which I saved as a separate file, complete with metadata, the planting of the invoice, the demand for money, and the police visit. Exhibit D financials was where I saved the information linking her Venmo to the old, investigated fundraising name. I felt a grim satisfaction as the file grew. It was clean, organized, and irrefutable. Every claim was supported by a piece of time-stamped, digital evidence. This was my world. In this world, their tears and emotional manipulations had no value. The data was all that mattered. With my case file complete, there was one final step to take. I opened a new, incognito browser window and navigated to the official website of the Internal Revenue Service. I found the link for the Form 3949A, Information Referral. It was a tool for citizens to report suspected tax fraud, anonymously. I began to fill out the form. For the subjects, I listed Diane Morgan and Melissa Albright. For the nature of the violation, I checked several boxes: false altered document, unreported income, and organized crime. In the narrative section, I laid out the facts with the same dispassionate clarity I used in my professional audit reports. I described a multi-year pattern of soliciting funds for fraudulent charitable causes through online platforms, using linked personal bank accounts to collect untaxed income. I mentioned the most recent event, the attempt to extort $1,850 through a forged catering invoice, as the latest example in this ongoing scheme. I didn't include my name. I didn't need to. I simply attached a few of the key pieces of evidence: the steakhouse photo, the fake invoice, and the screenshot of the old blog post about the Attorney General's investigation. I reviewed the form one last time, my finger hovering over the submit button. This was the point of no return. This was escalating things beyond family court or small claims. This was inviting the most feared and relentless financial investigators in the country to look into their lives. I thought of Ava's face, her small voice asking if Grandma's GPS was broken. I thought of the 24 empty chairs. I thought of my mother's smiling face in that steakhouse, her caption a monument to her own cruelty. They had built their lives on a foundation of lies, propped up by emotional blackmail and the assumption that I would always, eventually, back down. They had made the mistake of thinking the rules didn't apply to them. A cold, hard certainty settled in my chest. They wanted to play a game using the law as their weapon of choice. Fine. I'll play with you, I whispered to the empty room, but we're going to play by my rules. I clicked submit. The 2 days after I sent my conciliatory text message were eerily quiet. I had dangled the bait, the promise of $1,850, and they had taken it, retreating into a smug silence to await their prize. I knew they would be expecting the Venmo notification to pop up on their phones at any moment, a digital confirmation of their victory. They would see it as proof that their tactics had worked, that a little pressure and a police visit were all it took to put the overly independent Rachel back in her place. This quiet, however, was not the silence of peace. It was the low-pressure stillness before a hurricane makes landfall. I went about my days with a strange, bifurcated focus. On the surface, I was mom making school lunches, helping with homework, reading bedtime stories to Ava. But underneath, a separate part of my brain was running complex calculations, monitoring my phone, and waiting for their next, inevitable mistake. It came on a Thursday evening. I was wiping down the kitchen counters after dinner when my phone buzzed with a Facebook notification. An aunt had tagged me in a post. My stomach tightened, not with fear, but with a cold, electric anticipation. I dried my hands, took a steadying breath, and tapped the screen. There was my mother's face, filling the screen in a carefully composed selfie. She was looking slightly away from the camera, her brow furrowed in a practiced expression of maternal sorrow. The lighting was soft, probably from a nearby lamp, designed to make her look weary and vulnerable. It was a masterclass in passive-aggressive performance art. And then there was the caption. "It's so sad when you try your best, and it's still not enough." It began, oozing with false humility. "You raise your children to be kind and grateful, but sometimes one of them just doesn't understand the meaning of family. We are heartbroken that my daughter, Rachel, has refused to pay for what she ordered for her own child's party, leaving her sister to handle a huge bill. We just ask for your prayers during this difficult time." It was perfect, a perfect blend of victimhood, vague accusation, and a pious call for prayers to signal her moral high ground. She hadn't just told a lie. She had crowdsourced her martyrdom. I scrolled down. The piranhas had already begun to swarm. "Diane, I am so sorry you have to go through this," wrote a neighbor I hadn't spoken to in a decade. "Disgusting how ungrateful some people are," commented one of Melissa's friends. "You and Melissa have hearts of gold." An uncle chimed in. "She always was a difficult child. Some things never change." Dozens of them, a cascade of sympathy for my mother and condemnation for me, all based on a single, expertly crafted lie. They were building their narrative in real time, cementing me as the villain in our family's public history. A few years ago, this would have devastated me. It would have sent me into a spiral of shame and anger, compelling me to type out a frantic, defensive reply, a reply that would only make me look hysterical and unhinged. But I was no longer that person. I read every single comment with the detached interest of a sociologist studying a primitive tribe. This wasn't an attack on me, Rachel Morgan, the individual. This was an attack on a caricature they had created, and you can't reason with a caricature. So I didn't comment. I didn't reply. I didn't even angry react. I simply took a series of clean, clear screenshots of the entire post and all its comments, and saved them to my case file under Exhibit E Public Defamation. Then I opened my email. My next move had to be precise, untraceable, and aimed not at the court of public opinion, but at the arbiters of public fact. I composed a new message. My recipient was not a family member or a friend. It was the generic tips email address for the investigative team at Channel 8 News, the biggest local station in our part of Ohio. Their lead investigative reporter, a bulldog of a man named Martin Hayes, had a reputation for sinking his teeth into stories of local fraud and corruption and not letting go. The email itself was a model of restraint. There was no emotional plea, no long, rambling story, just two short, cryptic sentences. To tips@channel8news.com. Subject story. Tip local fundraiser. You may want to fact-check the fundraiser operating under the name Diane and Melissa's Family Events. Records show it was previously flagged by the state AG's office in 2022. I didn't sign my name. I sent it from a new, encrypted email address I had created for this single purpose. It was a breadcrumb, not a confession, a small, anonymous nudge in the right direction. I was betting on Martin Hayes' journalistic instincts. The mention of a prior investigation by the Attorney General would be more than enough to pique his interest. I had lit the fuse. Now, I just had to wait for the explosion. The next 2 days were the longest of my life. My mother's Facebook post remained up, gathering more sympathetic comments. Melissa sent me a single text, "Haven't forgotten about that Venmo transfer," with a winking emoji, oozing smug confidence. I didn't reply. I moved through my life in a state of suspended animation, every part of me focused on the ticking clock, waiting for 6 p.m. On Saturday evening, I made sure Ava was occupied with her tablet and a pair of headphones in her room. I sat alone on the sofa in the living room, the television tuned to Channel 8. The familiar opening theme for the 6 p.m. newscast began, the slick graphics and booming announcer's voice filling the room. I sat perfectly still, my hands resting on my knees, my pulse a steady, thrumming beat in my ears. They went through the top stories: a local city council dispute, a weather report, a human interest piece about a dog. My stomach began to twist with doubt. Had they dismissed my tip? Was it too small? Too vague? And then, the male anchor looked seriously into the camera. "And coming up after the break," he said, his voice grave, "our own Martin Hayes has an exclusive report on a local fundraising operation now under investigation for fraud. Are your donations really going to the causes you support? The answer may surprise you." I let out a breath I didn't realize I'd been holding. It was happening. When the show returned from the commercial break, the screen was filled with a graphic that read, "Community Concerns." The anchor introduced the segment. "For years, we've been telling you to be careful about who you donate to online. A recent tip to our newsroom has led us to a troubling situation involving a mother-daughter duo from right here in Fairview." And then it happened, filling the entire screen, broadcast to tens of thousands of homes across the state, was my mother's Facebook profile picture. The one from the steakhouse, her and Melissa, smiling, clinking their wine glasses. It was the same photo I had saved as evidence, now being used as the face of their own public disgrace. Martin Hayes's voiceover began, serious and methodical. He explained that a fundraiser calling itself Diane and Melissa's Family Events was under active investigation by the Internal Revenue Service's Criminal Investigation Division. He referenced the 2022 inquiry by the State Attorney General. He showed a blurred-out screenshot of the old GoFundMe page that had used my daughter's picture. He didn't mention my name. He didn't mention Ava's. He didn't have to. He simply laid out a pattern of suspicious activity, citing an anonymous source who claimed the duo was engaged in a pattern of soliciting funds for personal enrichment under the guise of charity. The segment lasted less than 3 minutes, but it was devastatingly effective. It was a clean, factual execution. The moment the report ended, my phone, which had been sitting silently on the cushion beside me, lit up. It was a text from Melissa. The smugness was gone, replaced by pure, frantic panic. "Rachel, did you do this?" I looked at her text, then back at the television, where the news had already moved on to sports. My fingers were calm as I typed my reply, choosing each word with surgical precision. "You did it to yourself. Melissa, I just turned on the light." I sent the message and then, out of curiosity, opened Facebook on my phone and navigated to my mother's page. I refreshed it once. Her post, the sad selfie, the litany of supportive comments, it was all still there. I counted to 10 and refreshed the page again. It was gone. Vanished. The entire post, with its carefully constructed narrative of my betrayal, had been scrubbed from existence, deleted in a desperate act of damage control. But it was too late. The warm, comforting glow of their social media echo chamber had been extinguished, and the harsh, cold reality was beginning to set in. They could delete the post. They could block the commenters who were surely now turning on them, but the internet never truly forgets. Somewhere out there, screenshots already existed, and more importantly, they couldn't delete an IRS investigation. They couldn't unring the bell I had just rung on the 6 o'clock news. The truth was out, and it was a force far more powerful and permanent than any of their lies. The aftermath of the news report was defined by a profound and unnerving silence. For 24 hours, my phone, which had previously been the delivery mechanism for so much of their casual cruelty, remained dark. There were no frantic calls, no accusatory texts, no desperate voicemails. It was as if the news report had created a vacuum, sucking all the sound and fury out of their universe and leaving only a void. This silence was different from the one that had followed the birthday party. That had been a silence of arrogance, of dismissal. This was the silence of shock and fear. It was the sound of a predator realizing it has just stumbled into a meticulously laid trap. I didn't revel in it. There was no triumphant feeling, no surge of vindictive joy. Instead, I felt a strange and hollow calm. I had set a series of events in motion, and all I could do now was wait for the inevitable collision. I went about my Sunday with a deliberate, almost meditative focus. I helped Ava build a sprawling Lego castle in the living room, its colorful plastic towers a monument to a world where things made sense. I did 2 loads of laundry, the rhythmic tumbling of the machine a soothing counterpoint to the quiet anxiety humming beneath my skin. I made a pot roast for dinner, the slow, savory aroma filling the house with a sense of comforting normalcy that felt both essential and utterly fraudulent. I was building a fortress of domesticity around myself and my daughter, a shield against the fallout I knew was coming. The call came just as dusk was settling, painting the sky outside my kitchen window in shades of bruised purple and orange. The caller ID flashed a name I hadn't seen in years, not since I had changed her contact from Mom to her full name Diane Morgan. It was a small act of emotional distancing I had performed a long time ago, and I had never been more grateful for it. I let it ring 3 times, a small, petty assertion of control. Then I took a deep breath, swiped to answer, and put the phone on speaker. Placing it on the granite countertop, I didn't say anything. I just waited. Rachel. Her voice was thin, reedy. All the blustering confidence, the patronizing maternal authority, had been stripped away. What was left was the raw, trembling voice of a woman who had just seen the foundations of her world crack. "I'm here," I said. My voice was even, low, devoid of any inflection. It was my auditor's voice, the one I used when I was about to ask a CFO to explain a multi-million-dollar discrepancy. There was a shaky inhale on the other end of the line. "Rachel, that news report, they're saying, the IRS, they called this afternoon, they're opening a formal investigation." The words tumbled out in a rushed, breathless cascade. "Honey, you have to stop this. You can call them back. You can tell them it was all a misunderstanding. You can withdraw the complaint." I looked across the room. Ava was sitting at the small arts and crafts table in the corner, headphones on, her tongue sticking out slightly in concentration as she colored in a picture of a mermaid. She was entirely absorbed in her own peaceful world, blissfully unaware of the toxic legacy I was dismantling on her behalf. I didn't file a complaint. "Mother," I said, my voice as cold and clear as glass, "I don't know what the news is talking about. I just sent them some publicly available information. I sent them the truth. What they do with it is their business." The lie was seamless. I had filed the complaint, but they could never prove it. My denial was a brick wall, smooth and impenetrable. There was a long pause on the other end of the line, a silence so profound I could hear the faint, staticky hum of the connection. I could picture her perfectly standing in her beige kitchen, the one she was so proud of, her hand gripping the phone, her carefully constructed world crumbling around her. I could picture the confusion on her face, the dawning horror that she was fighting an enemy she couldn't see, an enemy who wouldn't play by her rules of emotional manipulation. When she finally spoke, her voice had dropped to a near whisper, laced with a desperate, final plea. "Rachel, please, we're family." The word hung in the air between us, obscene in its dishonesty. Family. It was her trump card, the word she had used my entire life to justify neglect, to demand forgiveness without apology, to enforce loyalty without earning it. It was a word that was supposed to absolve all sins, but I had heard it one too many times. It had lost all its power. I looked at Ava again, at her small shoulders hunched over her coloring book, at the absolute, untroubled innocence of her posture. This was my family, this small, determined girl who had comforted me when her own heart was broken. The people on the other end of the phone were something else entirely. They were a liability, a debt I had finally decided to write off. Before I could respond, Ava, perhaps sensing my gaze, took off her headphones. She looked up, first at me, then at the phone on the counter. "Was that Grandma?" she asked, her voice clear and curious. "Yes, honey, it was," I said softly. Ava tilted her head, a thoughtful expression on her face. She picked up a blue crayon and began to carefully color the mermaid's tail. "Family doesn't call the cops on birthdays," she said, not with anger or sadness, but as a simple, matter-of-fact statement. It was a truth she had learned at 8 years old, a piece of wisdom that had taken me 38 years to fully embrace. A slow, genuine smile touched my lips for the first time in what felt like an eternity. I looked at the phone, at the name displayed on the screen. Exactly, I whispered, more to myself than to anyone else. My mother must have heard the finality in my tone, the quiet dismissal, because she didn't say anything else. After a few more seconds of charged silence, I heard a soft click as she hung up. The call was over, but the exchange was not. Less than a minute later, my phone buzzed, a text from Melissa. It was, I sensed, the last message I would ever receive from her. It consisted of 3 short, desperate words, the final, reflexive cry of a narcissist who sees their reflection shattering. You destroyed us. I stared at the words, at the neat, black and white finality of them on my screen. All the years of their casual cruelty, their calculated neglect, their petty scams and grand betrayals, all of it had been in the service of propping up their fragile sense of self, their us. It was an exclusive club built on lies, with my mother and sister as its only true members. I was never a part of it. I was just a resource to be exploited, a convenient villain to blame for their own inadequacies. They had destroyed themselves, piece by piece, lie by lie, over the course of decades. I hadn't destroyed them. I had just refused to be their collateral damage any longer. My thumbs moved deliberately over the keyboard. My reply short, precise, and surgically clean. You were never us. I hit send. I didn't wait for a reply. I didn't expect one. What was there left to say? I then performed the last act of this long, drawn-out drama. It wasn't dramatic or emotional. It was a simple, administrative task. I opened my contacts list. I found the entry for Diane Morgan. I scrolled to the bottom of the screen and tapped the option that read, Block this caller. A small confirmation window popped up. I tapped Block Contact. Her name vanished from my recent calls list. Next, I found Melissa Albright. I did the same thing. Tap, confirm, block. Then I went through my uncles, my aunts, my cousins, every single person who had seen my mother's post and either chimed in with their support or remained silently complicit. Block, block, block. Each tap was a quiet snip of a thread, a severing of a tie that had long been frayed and rotten. When I was finished, my contacts list was significantly shorter. My world was significantly smaller, and for the first time in my entire life, it was quiet. It was a true, clean, and peaceful silence. A silence born not of fear or unspoken anger, but of freedom. The storm had not been weathered, it had been diverted, and it was now raging over a different house, a different family, leaving mine in the calm, quiet eye of my own making. The 3 weeks that followed were a study in absolute deafening silence. The digital amputation I had performed was a complete success. No unknown numbers tried to call. No anonymous emails appeared in my inbox. It was as if my mother and sister, along with their entire sphere of influence, had been erased from my world. The quiet was so profound it was almost a physical presence in my home, a welcome guest that settled in the empty spaces their drama used to occupy. The IRS, I knew, did not operate on a dramatic timeline. Their gears turned slowly, quietly, and with crushing force. I had set the machine in motion, and now my role was simply to wait and trust the process. Life with Ava returned to its normal, happy rhythm of school, homework, and weekend trips for ice cream. For the first time, I felt like I could breathe without waiting for the other shoe to drop. Then, one Tuesday afternoon, the knock came. It was the same firm, official knock as before, but this time, when I looked through the peephole, I felt no jolt of adrenaline, no surge of fear. My heart rate remained perfectly even. I saw 2 figures on my porch, but they weren't the uniformed patrol officers from before. These were 2 people in plain clothes, a man in a slightly rumpled suit, and a woman with a sharp blazer and a no-nonsense expression. Detectives. I opened the door before they could knock again. Rachel Morgan, the woman asked, her eyes sharp and analytical. Yes. Can I help you? She held up her badge. Detective Harding, Fairview Police Department. This is Detective Miller. We're following up on a report you were involved in a few weeks ago. May we have a moment of your time?" "Of course," I said, stepping back to let them in. "Please, have a seat." We sat at the dining room table, the same place where I had presented my evidence to the patrolman. But this was different. This wasn't about defending myself. This was about building their case. "Ms. Morgan," Detective Harding began, opening a file she'd been carrying. "The initial complaint filed by your sister, Melissa Albright, was dismissed as unfounded. However, the information you provided, combined with a few other factors, prompted us to look a little deeper into the matter." "Other factors?" I asked, keeping my tone neutral. Detective Miller leaned forward slightly. "Your sister has a habit of involving law enforcement in financial disputes. It turns out, after her complaint against you backfired, we cross-referenced her name in our system. We found 2 other instances in the past year where she'd accused people of non-payment for services. One was a local artisan she'd commissioned for a piece of pottery. The other was a landscaping company. In both cases, she produced a similar-looking handwritten invoice as proof of a contract, and in both cases, the other party claimed the invoice was a complete fabrication." I felt a cold knot tighten in my stomach. This was worse, more pathological than I had ever imagined. It wasn't just me, it was a pattern, a modus operandi. "Those cases were dismissed for lack of evidence," Harding continued. "Considered a he said, she said, civil matter. But your evidence, specifically the security footage of her placing the document on your door, changed the context. It established a clear precedent for deceptive and potentially fraudulent behavior. It gave us probable cause to subpoena her financial records." This was it, the point of no return. "We're here today to take a formal witness statement," Harding said. "We need you to walk us through the events of your daughter's birthday party and the subsequent demand for money, on the record." I spent the next hour calmly and methodically recounting the story, from the empty chairs at the party to the text messages and the police visit. I left out the emotion, the years of backstory, the pain. I gave them only the facts, the clean, verifiable data points of the case. They recorded my statement, asking clarifying questions with professional detachment. When I was finished, Detective Miller looked at me. "In your initial conversation with the officers, you mentioned you had organized the evidence. Would you be willing to submit that to us formally?" "Of course," I said. I went to my office and returned with a small, silver USB drive. I handed it to him. "It's all in there. I've labeled the files by exhibit, the video, the screenshots of the text messages, the social media post, the photo of the forged invoice, and my correspondence with a legal expert confirming its nature. It's all time-stamped." Miller took the drive, a flicker of surprise in his eyes. He turned to Harding. "She's got it all organized like a case file." I offered a small, thin smile. "Old habits from work," I said. As they were preparing to leave, Detective Harding paused at the door. "Just so you're aware, Ms. Morgan, your mother has been active. She's called the station multiple times, claiming this is all a terrible misunderstanding, that you've been emotionally unstable since your divorce, and that your sister was only trying to help you. We just wanted you to know that it is not impacting the investigation in any way." "I appreciate that," I said. It was exactly what I expected. The same old playbook, the same tired narrative. But this time, the audience wasn't a captive group of enabling relatives. It was the Fairview Police Department, and they were not impressed. A week later, Melissa was formally charged with forgery and filing a false police report. The summons was delivered to my mother's house. I learned later, from a mutual acquaintance who couldn't resist passing on the gossip, that my mother had immediately tried to launch a counteroffensive. She told anyone who would listen that it was just a silly family spat, a simple misunderstanding that the police were blowing way out of proportion. She insisted Melissa was the victim of my vindictive, unstable campaign of harassment. Her narrative, however, had a fatal flaw. It couldn't stand up to the unblinking, impartial judgment of bank records. The IRS investigation, running parallel to the local police case, had been ruthlessly efficient, because the fraudulent invoice was tied to Melissa's Venmo account, and that Venmo account was tied to a specific bank account. Investigators were able to follow the money, and what they found buried Diane's misunderstanding story under an avalanche of damning evidence. The account, the same one linked to the old Diane and Melissa's family events fundraiser, showed a pattern of deposits going back 4 years. There were dozens of small, untraceable donations from their various online sob stories, but there were also larger payments, checks from the local artisan and the landscaper who had been bullied into paying Melissa's fake invoices to avoid a protracted legal battle. All told, more than $24,000 had been funneled through the account undeclared, untaxed income from a series of petty, cruel grifts. When I heard the final number, I felt no thrill of victory. There was no joy, no triumphant fist pump. I simply felt a sense of completion. It was the same feeling I got at the end of a long, complex audit when I finally reconciled all the accounts and the final number on my spreadsheet matched the evidence. It wasn't about emotion, it was about a logical conclusion. The data had been gathered, the rules had been applied, and the outcome was the only one possible. The equation was finally balanced. That night, as I was tucking Ava into bed, she looked up at me from under her unicorn-themed duvet. The house was quiet, the only light coming from her small dinosaur nightlight, casting soft shadows on the walls. She had been blissfully unaware of the detectives, the charges, the entire sordid affair I had managed like a silent background process in her life, but she was perceptive. She knew something had shifted, that the tense, unhappy cloud of her extended family had finally dissipated. "Mom," she said, her voice small and sleepy, "will Grandma and Aunt Melissa come to my next birthday?" I sat on the edge of her bed and smoothed the hair back from her forehead. I looked into her wide, trusting eyes and felt a profound sense of peace settle over me. A peace I had fought for and won. This was the reason for all of it. This quiet moment, this safe room, this protected innocence. "No, honey," I said softly, my voice full of a certainty that resonated deep in my bones. "They won't be coming. And you know what? That's the best gift of all." The day of the hearing was a crisp, unremarkable Tuesday in late October. The sky was a pale, washed-out blue, and the air held the metallic chill of impending winter. The Fairview County Courthouse was not an imposing temple of justice. It was a squat, brown brick building from the 1970s, a place that smelled of stale coffee, old paper, and the faint, anxious sweat of 1,000 minor dramas. The hallways were lined with scuffed linoleum, and the light from the long fluorescent tubes in the ceiling cast a flat, unflattering glow on everything, draining the world of color and nuance. It was a building designed for bureaucracy, not catharsis. Because the charges were misdemeanors, the proceedings were held in a small, cramped courtroom on the second floor. It was a far cry from the dramatic settings I'd seen on television. There were perhaps 5 rows of worn, polished wooden benches for observers. The judge, a woman with tired eyes and a sensible haircut, sat on a slightly elevated platform that seemed more functional than intimidating. The room felt airless, heavy with the weight of small, sad stories, traffic violations, petty thefts, and today, my family's self-immolation. I was there as the primary witness for the prosecution. I hadn't wanted to come, but the assistant district attorney, a young, earnest man named Mr. Davies, had insisted it was necessary. My testimony, he explained, would provide the crucial context for the forgery charge. I wore a simple navy blue dress, my professional armor. I felt strangely calm, my pulse a slow, steady rhythm. I was not here for an emotional confrontation. I was here to perform a function, to present a series of documented facts, a task for which my entire career had prepared me. I saw them the moment I walked in. My mother and Melissa were sitting in the front row, as close as they could get to the defense table. They looked smaller in this sterile environment, stripped of the familiar backdrop of my mother's over-decorated living room. My mother was dressed in a funereal black suit, her face a mask of strained piety, her hands clutching a large, expensive-looking handbag in her lap like a shield. Melissa was a ghost of her former self. The vibrant, charming social butterfly was gone. In her place was a pale, drawn woman who looked like she hadn't slept in weeks. She was wearing a plain, ill-fitting gray sweater, the color of ash. Her usually perfect hair was limp and lifeless, and dark. Bruised-looking circles ringed her eyes. She sat with her shoulders hunched, staring at her hands, which she twisted in her lap. Throughout the entire preliminary proceedings, she never once looked at me. Her avoidance was a tangible thing, a force field of shame and resentment that I could feel from across the room. When my name was called, I walked to the witness stand with steady, measured steps. The wood of the railing was smooth and cool beneath my hand. I was sworn in, my voice clear and even in the quiet room. Mr. Davies led me through the testimony, his questions simple and direct. I recounted the story in a monotone, presenting the facts as I had organized them on the USB drive. I spoke of the party, the 24 empty chairs, the text message demanding $1,850, the fabricated invoice, and the security camera footage of my sister planting it on my door. I presented the evidence logically, chronologically, and without emotion. I was an auditor presenting my findings. When Melissa's defense attorney, a harried-looking public defender, had his chance to cross-examine me, his questions were weak and grasping. He tried to paint me as a bitter, vindictive sister, lashing out over a simple family squabble. Isn't it true, Ms. Morgan, that you and your sister have had a difficult relationship for some time? He asked. We have had our disagreements, I replied calmly. And isn't it possible that this whole affair, the invoice, the money was just a simple misunderstanding between two sisters who weren't communicating well? A misunderstanding doesn't typically involve filing a false police report, I said, my voice unwavering. He had no further questions. I was dismissed from the stand and returned to my seat on the opposite side of the aisle from my mother, a wide, empty space separating us. The rest of the hearing was a formality. The evidence was overwhelming, the bank records irrefutable. Melissa did not take the stand. The judge reviewed the files, her expression growing more weary with each page she turned. Finally, she took off her reading glasses and looked directly at my sister. The verdict was delivered without fanfare. Guilty on both counts: forgery and filing a false police report. The sentence was what Mr. Davies had predicted: 2 years of probation, a $400 fine, and 200 hours of mandatory community service for the separate, more serious matter of the tax evasion. The IRS would be levying its own fines and penalties, a punishment that would likely cripple them financially for years. It was in that moment, as the judge's words settled into the silent room, that Melissa finally broke. A strangled sob escaped her lips. Her entire body began to shake. She looked up at the judge, her face streaked with tears, a mask of pure, unadulterated self-pity. I just wanted attention, she wailed, her voice cracking. It wasn't an apology. It wasn't an admission of guilt. It was an excuse, the same childish, self-centered plea that had been the driving force of her entire life. She wasn't sorry for what she did. She was sorry she got caught. I watched her, and I felt nothing. No pity, no anger, no satisfaction. It was like watching a machine that had finally, inevitably, broken down. I leaned forward slightly, and though I barely whispered the words, they felt as loud as a gunshot in the quiet room. You got it, I murmured. Just not the kind you wanted. No one heard me but myself. It wasn't for them. It was for me. The judge looked down at Melissa, her face a mixture of pity and professional exasperation. She didn't acknowledge the outburst. She simply looked to the bailiff. Next case. And then, my mother turned. For the first time all day, she looked directly at me. Her face was pale, her eyes burning with a cold, impotent fury. Her lips were a thin, white line. She didn't raise her voice. She didn't have to. Her words, delivered in a venomous hiss that cut across the aisle, were meant to be the final, killing blow. You ruined your sister, she said. I met her gaze without flinching. All the years of pain, of being dismissed, of being the collateral damage in their toxic games, coalesced into a single, clarifying thought. I thought of my daughter, her small, hopeful face on her birthday, her quiet confusion when no one came, and I gave my mother the only truth that mattered. "She ruined my daughter's smile," I replied, my voice quiet but unshakable. Her face crumpled, as if I had struck her. She had no response. The truth was a language she didn't speak. A sharp crack echoed through the room as the judge's gavel hit the wooden block. "This court is adjourned." The sound broke the spell. It was over. I stood up, my movements fluid, my body feeling lighter than it had in years. I didn't look at them again. I turned and walked toward the heavy double doors at the back of the courtroom. As I pushed them open, I was hit by a flood of brilliant, unfiltered sunlight. I had been in the dim, artificial light of the courthouse for so long that the brightness was almost shocking. I had to raise a hand to shield my eyes. I walked down the concrete steps and into the cool October air. The feeling was indescribable. It was as if a physical weight, a dense, heavy stone that I had been carrying in the center of my chest for my entire adult life, had simply dissolved, turning into dust and blowing away on the afternoon breeze. I had not come here seeking revenge. I had not been driven by hatred or a desire to see them suffer. Hatred was their currency, a messy, chaotic emotion that consumed everything it touched. I had simply chosen a different weapon. I had armed myself with spreadsheets and screenshots, with timelines and digital records. I had not fought them with their own fire. I had simply presented them with the truth. And as I stood there on the sun-drenched sidewalk, a free woman in every sense of the word, I acknowledged the final, stark reality of what I had done. The truth, in the end, was cruel enough. The legal proceedings ended not with a bang, but with the quiet rustle of paperwork. The ripples, however, continued to spread outward, touching the shores of our small community in ways I hadn't anticipated. About a week after the hearing, the Ohio Attorney General's office, prompted by the now official IRS investigation, released a public list of defunct or suspended charitable organizations as a consumer warning. It was a dry bureaucratic document, posted as a PDF on their website. But there, at the very top of the list, alphabetized under D, was the name Diane and Melissa's Family Events. Seeing it there, in the cold, black-and-white finality of a government document, was more validating than any courtroom verdict. The fiction they had so carefully constructed had been officially and irrevocably dismantled. The public listing was a dam-breaking. Suddenly, my carefully curated silence was punctuated by the gentle chime of incoming emails. They weren't from the family I had excised, but from the community that had, for a brief time, judged me. The messages fell into two categories. First were the apologies. They came from distant cousins and old family friends, people who had liked my mother's Facebook post or had whispered their disapproval at a safe distance. Their emails were invariably sheepish, full of phrases like, "I only ever heard one side of the story, and I feel just terrible about this." I read them, deleted them, and felt nothing. Their validation was a currency I no longer accepted. The second category of messages, however, was different. These were notes from strangers and acquaintances, people who had also been caught in my sister's smaller webs. The local artisan from whom Melissa had tried to extort money for a flawed piece of pottery wrote to thank me for my courage. A woman who had hired my mother to cater a small baby shower, only to be overcharged and verbally berated, sent a short, powerful message. "Thank you for standing up. You did what the rest of us were too afraid to do." These messages were a revelation. I hadn't just been fighting for myself and my daughter. I had, inadvertently, been fighting for them too. I hadn't just closed a chapter in my own life. I had closed a business that had been preying on the kindness and conflict avoidance of good people for years. The true epilogue, however, was not written in a government document or a stranger's email. It was written in the warm, flickering glow of birthday candles. 2 weeks after the court date, on a quiet Saturday afternoon, we had another party for Ava. There was no tent in the backyard, no bounce house, no long, empty table set for 24 ghosts. This party was held in our cozy dining room. The guest list was small. There was me, and Ava, There was Mrs. Gable from next door, a kind widow in her 70s who had brought over a Tupperware container of her famous lemon bars. And there was the Jackson family from across the street, a young couple with a daughter Ava's age. 5 people in total. The cake was not a 3-tiered masterpiece from a fancy bakery. It was a simple, single-layer chocolate cake that Ava and I had baked together that morning. Its frosting slightly lopsided. Its sprinkles applied with the joyous abandon of an 80-year-old. The presents weren't a massive, intimidating pile. There were 3 small, thoughtfully wrapped gifts on the table. The air was not filled with the tense expectation of a performance, but with the easy, genuine sound of laughter. When it was time for the cake, we gathered around the small dining table. Mr. Jackson lit the 8 candles, and the room was bathed in a soft, warm light. We all sang happy birthday, our voices slightly off-key but full of affection. Ava closed her eyes, her face scrunched in concentration as she made her wish, and then she blew. All 8 candles went out in a single puff. As we clapped, she looked around the table at the 4 smiling faces looking back at her, a thoughtful, serious expression, one that I recognized as her figuring things out look, settled on her face. "You know, Mom," she said, her voice clear and bright in the happy quiet. This time, everyone who came meant it. Her words struck me with the force of a physical blow, a truth so simple and profound that it took my breath away. She had understood. She had felt the hollowness of the first party, the performative nature of all those empty promises, and she recognized the solid, unshakable truth of this small gathering. I looked at the faces around my table, a kind neighbor, a friendly family, and felt a wave of gratitude so intense it almost brought me to tears. I had spent so many years chasing a fantasy of family, trying to force a connection where none existed. I had been so focused on the family I had lost that I had failed to see the one I was building, right here on my own quiet street. As Ava dug into her lopsided chocolate cake, I sat back in my chair, watching the smoke from the extinguished candles curl lazily toward the ceiling. In the reflection of the dining room window, I could see the scene behind me, a small group of people, bound not by blood or obligation, but by simple, uncomplicated kindness. And I finally understood. True family wasn't a matter of shared DNA. It wasn't a name you inherited or a history you were forced to carry. It was a choice. It was a matter of shared honesty. It was about who showed up, not just for the party, but in the quiet, ordinary moments. It was about who looked at your child with genuine affection. It was about who you could trust to mean it. In the weeks that followed, the final vestiges of my old life were quietly swept away. One evening, out of a morbid sense of curiosity, I searched for Melissa on social media, her profiles, once a carefully curated stage for her dramatic life, were gone. The accounts were either deleted or set to a level of privacy so absolute that she had effectively vanished from the digital world. She had become a ghost, retreating from the public eye that had, for a brief, humiliating moment, seen her for exactly who she was. The final step was for me. A month after the hearing, I went to the phone store. It felt like a small, anticlimactic act, but its symbolism was immense. I requested a new number. The clerk, a bored-looking teenager, processed the request in under 5 minutes. I walked out of the store with a new string of 10 digits, a clean slate. I sent the new number to Kayla, to the Jacksons, to the handful of other people who belonged in my new, smaller, more honest world, and that was it. The last thread was cut. The last door was locked. No one from my past could reach me unless I wanted them to. That night, as Ava slept soundly in her room, I sat on the couch in the living room in complete darkness. For the first time, I was aware of the silence of my own home. It was a silence I had never truly experienced before. For the past 10 years, my home had never been truly quiet. It had always been filled with a low-frequency hum of anxiety, the background static of waiting for the next manipulative phone call, the next passive-aggressive text, the next manufactured crisis. I had been living in a constant state of low-grade emotional siege. Now, That was gone. The silence in the house was no longer an absence of sound. It was a presence. It was the sound of peace. It was the sound of safety. It was the sound of a life that was finally, completely, and unapologetically my own. And I liked it. I liked the quiet very much. The autumn that followed the court hearing was the quietest I had known in a decade. The leaves on the maple tree in my front yard turned a fiery, defiant red, then drifted silently to the ground, carpeting the lawn in a blanket of crimson and gold. It was a season of release, of letting go. The silence from my former family was absolute. It was no longer the charged, humming quiet of a brewing conflict, but the deep, settled silence of an abandoned house. The phone number I had blocked was a ghost, a connection to a life that no longer existed. One morning, nearly a month after the verdict, I was sifting through the mail at my kitchen counter, bills, junk mail, a catalog for winter coats, and then I saw it, a plain, standard white envelope with a government return address. No dramatic seals or urgent stamps. It was mundane, bureaucratic. My hands were steady as I slid my finger under the flap and pulled out the single sheet of paper inside. The letter was brief, typed in a soulless, impersonal font. It was a simple notification from the county prosecutor's office. It informed me that, pursuant to the plea agreement, the case against Melissa Albright was now considered adjudicated and officially closed. At the bottom was a line of black ink, case closed. 2 words, the final, anticlimactic period at the end of a long and ugly sentence. There would be no dramatic apology on my doorstep, no tearful phone call begging for forgiveness. I knew, with a certainty that settled deep in my bones, that I would never hear from them again, not because they were remorseful, but because they had been defeated, their most potent weapons guilt, manipulation, public shaming, and even the law itself had been rendered useless. There was nothing left for them to say, no angle left for them to play. They had not apologized, but they would never, ever call the police on me again. I folded the letter neatly and placed it in the back of my file cabinet. Inside the folder labeled Case File 922. It was the final document. Then, I sat down at my computer. I opened the folder on my hard drive, the one that contained all the evidence I had so meticulously gathered, the screenshots, the video file, the audio recordings of my witness statement. My finger hovered over the mouse. For a moment, I considered keeping it, a digital trophy of a war I had won. But that wasn't right. It wasn't a trophy. It was a weapon, and the war was over. Keeping it would be like keeping a loaded gun in a peaceful house. I dragged the entire folder to the trash icon on my desktop, and then I emptied the trash. A small progress bar appeared, and in less than 5 seconds, it was all gone, every last byte. It was a quiet, digital cleansing. I had used the data to establish the truth, and now that the truth was a matter of public record, the data itself was no longer necessary. That evening, the first real cold snap of the season had settled over Fairview. A sharp, biting wind rattled the windows, and I had a fire crackling in the hearth. Ava and I were curled up on the sofa under a thick wool blanket, reading a book about a girl who could talk to animals. The house was warm and safe, a small island of light and comfort against the encroaching dark. As I finished a chapter, Ava snuggled closer to me, her small body warm against my side. She was quiet for a long time, watching the flames dance and spit in the fireplace. "Mom," she finally said, her voice a soft murmur against the crackling of the logs. "Yes, honey." She turned her head to look up at me, her eyes serious and searching in the firelight. "Are we safe now?" The question was so simple, so innocent, but it landed with the weight of everything we had been through. She wasn't just asking about locked doors or a good alarm system. She was asking if the monsters were gone for good. She was asking if the quiet sadness that had haunted the edges of our lives had finally been banished. I brushed a stray curl from her forehead. My heart filled with a fierce, protective love. I could have told her yes. I could have told her that the bad people were gone and would never bother us again. But that wasn't the real truth. The real truth was more powerful. "Sweetheart," I said softly, meeting her gaze. "We were always safe. They just didn't know it." A small furrow appeared between her eyebrows as she considered this. I knew she was old enough to understand. Safety wasn't something other people gave you. It wasn't the absence of threats. It was the knowledge that you had the strength, the intelligence, and the courage to face those threats and win. We hadn't been victims who were rescued. We had been warriors who had defended our own castle. They had tried to burn our world down, and we had stood our ground, armed not with anger, but with the indestructible shield of the truth. We hadn't become safe. We had simply proven that we already were. Later that night, after Ava was asleep, I stood in the darkened living room, looking out the large window into the backyard. The moon was high and bright, casting a silver, ethereal glow on the lawn. My mind drifted back to that day, to the painful, perfect image of the empty party. I could still see it with perfect clarity, the white tent, a stark monument to my own misplaced hope, the long, lonely table, the 24 empty chairs standing like silent, accusing gravestones. But that was a memory now, a ghost. My gaze shifted to the new reality of the space. The tent was long gone. In its place was a beautiful stone patio that I had spent a month of weekends building with my own 2 hands. A sturdy wooden picnic table sat in the center, its surface scarred with the happy marks of a summer well-lived, a few water rings from glasses of lemonade, a small smudge of ketchup from a recent barbecue. The chairs around it were not the pristine, white folding chairs of a rental company. They were a mismatched, comfortable collection of patio furniture, the kind that invites people to sit and stay a while. A sudden gust of wind swept through the yard, rustling the bare branches of the maple tree, and in that sound, I could almost hear the echoes of a different party. I could hear the sound of Mrs. Gable's delighted laugh as Mr. Jackson told a terrible joke. I could hear the sound of Ava and her friend shrieking with joy as they chased each other through the sprinklers. I could hear the low, easy murmur of real conversation, the comfortable silence of real friendship. None of them were there. Not my mother, not my sister, not a single one of the 24 people who had chosen a steak dinner over my daughter's smile. Their absence was no longer a gaping wound. It was a clean, empty space, a space that I had now filled with people who had chosen to be here, people who brought with them not obligation and drama, but lemon bars and laughter. I didn't need them anymore. I am telling you this story not to celebrate a victory or to gloat over a fallen enemy. I'm telling you this because I learned something in the fire of those few weeks, something I think is worth sharing. For years, I believed that the loudest voice won the argument. My family operated on a principle of emotional terrorism, believing that whoever could scream, cry, or accuse the loudest would control the narrative. But they were wrong. I won not by shouting back, but by being quiet. My silence in the face of their public shaming was an indictment. My methodical, dispassionate collection of facts was an indictment. My refusal to engage in their messy, emotional games was the most powerful indictment of all. Sometimes, the quietest person in the room is the one who holds all the power, because their power is rooted not in noise, but in truth. I turned from the window, the moonlit yard fading behind me. I walked through the quiet house, my bare feet silent on the hardwood floors. I checked the lock on the front door, a simple, nightly ritual. As I turned to walk toward the stairs, my hand brushed against the wall in the entryway. My fingers found the cool, smooth surface of a small, framed piece of slate I had hung there a few weeks ago. It was simple, the words etched in a clean, white font. It wasn't a trophy, it was a reminder, a personal monument to the only principle that had mattered. I reached for the light switch, plunging the first floor into a peaceful, comfortable darkness. The plaque was invisible now, but I didn't need to see it to know what it said. No police can undo the truth. Thank you so much for listening to my story. It means the world to me. I'm always curious to know where my stories are reaching. So please, drop a comment below and let me know where you're listening from. I'd love to hear your thoughts on this, so feel free to share and connect with each other in the comments as well. If you enjoyed this and want to hear more stories like it, Please consider subscribing to the channel and giving this video a like. And if you really want to help this story get heard by more people, please hit that hype button. It makes a huge difference.